She didn't speak, didn't beg, just pointed to cold leftovers and disappeared. 6 hours later, the same girl was found clutching a newborn in the forest, half frozen, half dead. And what she said to police shocked the entire town. On a rainy Tuesday evening in the forgotten town of Maple Hollow, a little girl walked alone through the shadows, her bare feet silent against the cold pavement. She carried nothing but a threadbare scarf and the kind of stillness that made people look away. She wasn't begging. She wasn't crying. She simply stepped into the corner diner, eyes wide but unreadable, and pointed to a half-finished plate of mashed potatoes left behind by a stranger. No one knew her name. No one knew where she came from. And by morning she was gone like a ghost with hunger in her eyes. But that same night, beneath a flickering street lamp at the edge of Briarwood Park, her scream pierced the silence, a scream that didn't come from fear, but from defiance, because she had found something no one else had seen. A baby pale and shivering, abandoned in the cold. And for the first time in her young life, she chose to stay. That's how it began, not with a rescue, but with a girl who had every reason to run, and instead stepped forward. The rain hadn't stopped for hours. It fell in steady, icy sheets across the cracked sidewalks of Maple Hollow, a forgotten town tucked deep in rural Kentucky, where the street lamps flickered like dying fireflies, and no one walked unless they had somewhere urgent to be. But on this particular evening, just past 7 p.m., a girl no one recognized moved silently through the mist, her tiny frame swallowed by an oversized hoodie, soaked straight through her bare feet, slapping against the pavement without a sound. She was no older than 9, maybe younger, though the hard focus in her eyes made her seem older eyes that didn't dart around in fear, but scanned everything with the cautious precision of someone used to danger. She passed storefronts, long closed porches with rocking chairs left still, and a sheriff's cruiser parked beside the diner on Main Street. The steam from the building's windows glowed yellow against the gray world outside, and inside laughter from a late-night crowd of locals hummed low and lazy. She paused at the door, not in hesitation but calculation. Then she pushed it open and stepped inside. The sudden warmth hit her like a wall. Her wet hoodie dripped onto the checkered linoleum as she stood there, wordless, the bell above the door jingling once before. The silence swallowed it whole. A few heads turned. No one recognized her. She didn't speak, didn't smile, didn't cry. She simply walked up to the nearest table where a man had just left his plate half full and pointed at it. Not at the man, not at the waitress, just at the cold pile of mashed potatoes and fried chicken bones. Her expression unreadable, her chin lifted slightly in something almost like pride. The room stiffened. One woman gasped softly. A man near the counter muttered, "Now what's all this?" The waitress, middle-aged, kind-eyed, knelt down and asked gently, "Honey, are you hungry?" The girl didn't respond. She just looked at the food, then at the woman, then back again. When the waitress placed the plate in front of her, she picked up the plastic fork without a word and began to eat slowly, methodically, as if each bite had a purpose. The diner's atmosphere shifted. Conversations resumed, but in hushed tones, uncertain. After a few minutes, the girl stood up, wiped her mouth with the back of her hand, and walked out without a glance behind her. The door swung shut and the bell jingled again. She vanished into the storm like a shadow returned to the night, leaving behind only silence and a wet spot on the floor. By the time the waitress reached the door to follow, the street was empty. The girl was gone. No one knew her name. No one knew where she came from. But for those who had seen her, something about the way she moved, deliberate, unafraid, lingered like a whisper that wouldn't fade. The bell above the diner door gave a tired jingle as Ava stepped inside, her small figure, framed by the rain-soaked darkness behind her. For a moment, the warmth of the room wrapped around her like a shock. The air smelled like fried onions and black coffee, and the soft hum of conversation rippled through the booths and counter stools like a familiar song. No one noticed her at first. She was too quiet, too still. She didn't wipe her feet, didn't shake off the rain, didn't say a single word. just stood there, water dripping from the sleeves of her oversized hoodie, her hands clenched at her sides, and her eyes, those sharp, wide, unblinking eyes, scanned the room with a wariness far too old for a girl who couldn't have been more than 9. She moved forward slowly, carefully, like someone stepping onto unfamiliar ground, though every movement felt rehearsed. She wasn't here by accident. She passed the counter. The tables of older men sipping bourbon in coffee mugs, the waitress refilling drinks with a tired smile. Then she stopped. At a corner booth near the window, a man had just left his plate still half full with mashed potatoes, green beans, and the gnawed remains of a pork chop. Ava pointed. Not to the waitress, not to the menu, not even to her own mouth, just to the plate. Her finger hovered there unwavering. And that's when people began to notice. The sound of forks against plates slowed. One woman leaned closer to her husband and whispered something. The waitress, gray streaks in her ponytail apron stained with grease, approached, gently bending slightly to meet the girl's gaze. "Sweetheart, are you okay?" she asked. Ava said nothing. She didn't nod, didn't flinch, just kept pointing. It wasn't begging. It wasn't desperate. It was precise. As if she had done this before. As if she knew the line between pity and permission and was walking it carefully. The waitress looked at the plate, then at the girl, then back at the plate again. Without another word, she picked it up and brought it over to the counter. A clean fork followed. She placed them both in front of Ava. The girl didn't say thank you. She didn't smile. She sat down at the booth, picked up the fork, and began to eat slowly, carefully, like every bite had to count. No one knew what to say. No one stopped her. They just watched silent and unsure as this little ghost of a girl claimed someone else's leftovers like she belonged there. The longer Ava sat in that corner booth eating from a stranger's leftovers, the heavier the air inside the diner became. The low murmur of conversation had shrunk into a hush, as if the entire room had paused in collective discomfort. Forks hovered above plates. Coffee cooled untouched, and glances, some subtle others openly staring, kept drifting back to the soaked little girl who didn't speak, didn't smile, didn't ask for anything. A woman near the window wrapped in a shawl, and pearls too fancy for Maple Hollow, shook her head slowly, with a sigh. Poor thing. She muttered, not loud enough to interrupt the quiet, but just loud enough to be heard. A man at the counter, broad-shouldered in his 60s, with a sheriff's badge sewn onto his jacket, watched with a mixture of suspicion and concern. That was Deputy Hank Turner. He didn't like strange things he couldn't explain, and a lone child eating cold food without a word triggered every protective instinct he had. He leaned over to the waitress and whispered something. She gave a soft nod and disappeared into the back. Meanwhile, Ava continued chewing with the same slow, methodical rhythm, her eyes flicking to every movement in the room. She wasn't oblivious, she was calculating. Every twitch of the waitress's hands, every whisper exchanged between customers, the way the man at the counter kept shifting in his seat, she saw it all. The pity in their eyes didn't move her. She'd seen it before. She didn't want their sympathy. She wanted food safety, and maybe 5 more minutes before someone made her leave. Behind the counter, the cook peeked out from the kitchen door, wiping his hands on his apron, mouthing, "You calling CPS?" The waitress nodded. Once, tight-lipped. By now, the diner's atmosphere had shifted into something fragile. The rain still tapped against the windows, but inside there was a storm building, quiet, administrative, inevitable. Deputy Turner reached for his radio but hesitated. He wasn't heartless, just cautious. A child alone with no shoes on a night like this. Something was wrong. He stood up slowly and began walking toward her hand resting near his belt, voice low and steady. "Evening, sweetheart. Mind telling me your name?" Ava paused mid-bite. She didn't look scared, just resigned. She'd seen this moment coming. She swallowed, placed the fork down with deliberate care, and slowly turned to face him. Her eyes met his, and for the first time, the diner fell completely still. For a long moment, the air between Ava and Deputy Turner held its breath. His question hung in the space between them like a fragile thread. "Evening, sweetheart. Mind telling me your name?" But Ava didn't speak. She didn't flinch or shift in her seat. She simply held his gaze with an eerie stillness, her eyes deep and unreadable like a locked door with no keyhole. Turner used to bluster, and fear found himself momentarily thrown. Before he could press further, the waitress, her name tag read. Marla reappeared from the kitchen, holding a brown paper bag, slightly damp from the steam rising off the still-warm contents inside. She approached cautiously, her voice softer now, like someone speaking to a wounded animal. "Honey," she said gently, crouching a little beside the booth. "Are you hungry?" Ava didn't speak, but this time something changed. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, she nodded. Just once. A single small gesture, but in that diner full of uncertainty, it cracked something open. Not a tear, not a smile, just that quiet, almost mechanical nod. Marla placed the bag on the table without pushing, without asking another question. "There's some chicken cornbread and a piece of peach pie. It's yours. You take it, okay?" Ava looked down at the bag, then back up at Marla. Her hand moved hesitant but controlled, and she pulled the bag toward her with practiced quiet. No one moved. Turner lowered his radio. The cook eased back into the kitchen. The pearl-draped woman by the window wiped at her eye and pretended she wasn't watching. Then, without another glance or word, Ava slid off the booth, tightened her grip on the paper bag, and walked toward the door. She didn't limp or rush. She just moved like someone who knew not to waste time. As the bell jingled once more and the door swung open, the cold, rain-scented wind rushed in briefly, wrapping around her like a curtain before she stepped into the darkness beyond. And just like that, she was gone. No one followed. Turner stood at the doorway, watching the sidewalk, the shadows, the empty street lamp flickering 2 blocks down, but there was no sign of her. Ava had vanished back into the night, leaving behind only a wet imprint on the booth's vinyl seat, a fork still resting beside an empty plate, and a diner full of people who suddenly realized they had witnessed something quietly extraordinary. Briarwood Park had once been the pride of Maple Hollow, but now it lay in near silence, abandoned by time and foot traffic. The playground's paint had long since chipped away, revealing rust beneath the yellow monkey bars and red slide. Weeds curled through the cracks of the pavement, creeping around the benches like quiet invaders. The only sounds that broke the stillness were the distant croaks of frogs from the muddy pond and the occasional gust of wind pushing dry leaves in circles. The park lamps, spaced too far apart and rarely maintained, flickered inconsistently, casting long, jittery shadows over the gravel paths. It was the kind of place where silence didn't comfort it unsettled. The swings squeaked softly as they moved with no one in them, and the old carousel turned half a degree with each breath of wind like it refused to die. No children played here. No parents lingered. Even dogs weren't walked in this part of town after dusk. It wasn't dangerous exactly, it was just forgotten. And on this night, with the rain now faded into mist, the park seemed to hold its breath. Somewhere beyond the twisted metal and rotting wood, down a slope of overgrown grass behind the pavilion, a figure moved. Small, silent, steady. Ava. Her feet barely made a sound on the soaked earth as she stepped between puddles and ducked under a splintered fence post. The paper bag she'd been given was now folded neatly and tucked beneath her arm. She wasn't hiding, she was searching. Her eyes moved across the shadows like she was looking for something she couldn't name. And then, through the fog and decay, came a sound no one was prepared for. A baby's faint, gasping cry. At first, Ava thought it was the wind catching in a rusted pipe or maybe an animal curled in the underbrush, but the sound came again, high-pitched, wet, and desperate. She froze, heart thudding, and turned toward the thicket of tall grass near the edge of the drainage ditch. Slowly, cautiously, she stepped forward, her bare feet making no sound on the wet ground. She parted the branches with trembling fingers, and that's when she saw it. A bundle small and motionless, wrapped in what looked like a torn piece of a floral sheet, soaked through with rain and mud. Her breath caught. It wasn't just a sound, it was a baby, a real living baby. His skin was dusky blue at the lips, and his tiny fists barely moved, curled like frozen petals. He let out a thin, weak cry that cracked halfway through like even his lungs were too cold to finish it. Ava dropped to her knees, not caring that the mud soaked her dress. She reached out, but not with panic, with a strange kind of steadiness, like this moment wasn't shocking to her, but inevitable. The baby's chest rose and fell shallowly, too slowly, too faintly. She touched his cheek ice. She looked around for anyone. Anything but the park remained hollow and dark. There were no headlights, no voices, just the wind through branches and that soft, dying whimper. Without hesitation, Ava unwrapped her scarf, the only thing she owned, and bundled it around the baby's body, pulling him close to her chest. She didn't cry. She didn't scream, but her eyes burned with something ancient and fierce. In that instant, she wasn't a hungry girl with no home. She was a shield, a fire, and she wasn't leaving this baby to die. Ava had spent years mastering the art of silence. It was her armor, her escape, the one thing that kept her invisible to the world that had never once asked her name. But now, kneeling in the cold mud of Briarwood Park, with a dying infant in her arms, that silence shattered. She looked down at the baby, barely breathing, wrapped only in her threadbare scarf, and without a second thought, she ripped off her oversized coat, the only real protection she had against the night air, and swaddled the baby tightly, pulling him against her chest with trembling hands. His body was so small, so light, it terrified her. She could feel the lack of warmth, the way his limbs didn't resist or push. Panic surged through her, hot and unfamiliar. Her mouth opened, and for the first time in days, maybe weeks, she screamed, "Help somebody, please." The sound was raw, wild, cracking like a branch splitting in a storm. It echoed off the empty swing set off the cracked walls of the old bathroom shelter, through the broken silence of Maple Hollow. "There's a baby," she cried again, louder, her voice stronger now, fueled by something deeper than fear, by sheer refusal. She didn't care who heard her. She didn't care if they scolded her, arrested her, sent her back to whatever shadows she'd come from. Her only focus was the child in her arms. She stood up, legs shaking, and ran toward the main path, screaming the same word over and over. Help. Help. Her voice tore through the night like lightning, bright and undeniable. In that moment, Ava, silent, unseen, unwanted, became impossible to ignore. The tires screeched before the headlights even caught her face. Daniel Whitmore wasn't supposed to be driving that way. Not tonight, not in this weather. He was only passing through the edge of Maple Hollow to avoid highway traffic, a shortcut he hadn't taken in years. But something instinct timing fate pulled him down Briarwood Drive, where the trees leaned in like silent witnesses. His eyes caught a blur of movement, a flash of red, and then he saw her, a small figure in the rain, flailing her arms with something bundled against her chest. He slammed the brakes, and the car jolted to a stop, engine humming, wipers clicking against the glass. For a moment, all he could do was stare. A little girl, soaked through barefoot, screaming into the wind with her voice cracking and raw. Then she looked directly at him, eyes wild with something that wasn't just fear. It was urgency. It was fury. It was the kind of pleading that didn't come from someone trying to save themselves. She pointed to the bundle in her arms and screamed, "Help him, please," before stumbling forward like her legs might give out. Daniel flung the door open and rushed toward her, heart pounding as the distance closed. "I've got you. What happened?" he said, kneeling beside her, hands already reaching out. She didn't explain. She just peeled back the coat and revealed the baby, unmoving lips, blue breath shallow. For a split second, the businessman, the billionaire, the man who built empires from nothing, forgot all of it. All he saw was a dying infant and a little girl who had sacrificed everything to keep him alive. Without hesitation, Daniel scooped the baby into his arms and shouted back, "Get in the car." Ava didn't hesitate. For the first time in her life, someone had listened without doubt, without questions. And for the first time in his life, Daniel Whitmore wasn't just passing through. He had stopped, and everything was about to change. Inside the car, the heat blasted but couldn't erase the way Ava shivered beside him, her eyes fixed on the tiny bundle in Daniel's lap as he drove with one hand and held the baby with the other. The baby had started to whimper, faintly small, broken sounds that told them time was still on their side, but not for long. Daniel's jaw was tight, his knuckles white on the steering wheel, but every few seconds he glanced at Ava in the rearview mirror. She hadn't said another word since climbing in. No name, no explanation, just silence and eyes that held too much for someone so small. When they reached the ER entrance, Daniel didn't hesitate. He leapt from the car, yelling for help, and within moments, nurses were rushing out, lifting the baby into warm, gloved hands and disappearing behind sliding doors. He turned back for Ava. She hadn't moved, just sat there in the back seat, soaked, knees drawn up, arms wrapped tightly around herself, like she was holding in something far more fragile than cold. "Come on," he said gently, offering a hand. She hesitated, her fingers twitching, but eventually reached out. The moment she stepped into the hospital lights, something shifted. Daniel noticed how everyone else looked at her like a stray dog, like a question, like a problem to be solved or pushed aside. But he also noticed the weight in her gaze, the silent strength it took to scream for someone else. As doctors worked to stabilize the baby, Daniel found himself watching Ava more than the monitors. Who was this girl? Where had she come from? Why had she been alone in a park during a freezing rainstorm, and why had she risked everything to save a life that wasn't hers? For reasons he couldn't explain, Daniel stayed. He didn't return to his car. He didn't check his phone. He sat beside the girl and waited. Something about her refused to let him go. Ava had never known what it meant to be someone's daughter. No photographs, no stories, no lullabies whispered in the dark. From the moment she could form memories, her world had been defined by gray walls, metal bunk beds, and the scratchy tag stitched onto her thin sweater number 9. That was her name, at least in the eyes of the state, the system, and the tired women who rotated shifts at the foster complex on the edge of the county. The place wasn't called a home. It was a temporary youth holding facility, but no one ever left. Not really. Ava had watched children age like ghosts. They're never adopted, never loved, just recycled through group therapy and silent mealtimes each day identical to the last. She had no last name, no known birthday, only a file number and a voice too quiet to be heard. They never called her Ava, not once. If a child cried too loud, they were sedated. If they asked too many questions, they were sent to isolation, a dark storage room with no windows and a locked door that clicked twice. Ava had been sent there once when she asked why number 2 suddenly disappeared, and no one spoke her name again. That night in the silence, Ava began to understand what it meant to be invisible. The other children stopped using names altogether. They whispered numbers like codes in the dark, and sometimes late at night they'd trace names onto the concrete walls with stolen crayons, names they wished someone had given them. Ava once wrote Maya just to see what it felt like, but it didn't fit. It wasn't hers. She had no idea where the name Ava had come from. It had surfaced like a dream, a sound she whispered into her pillow over and over until it began to feel like armor. A name she gave herself when no one else would. When the social workers came faces that changed monthly, they never looked at her twice. Paperwork got lost, birthdays were guessed, allergies ignored. The food was always beige, the lights always buzzed. But it was the silence that Ava remembered most. The silence when she fell and no one came. The silence when Trigger 7 got sick and didn't get better. The silence when she looked into the mirror and didn't recognize the eyes staring back. And so when she ran, she didn't tell anyone. She slipped out at dawn past the broken security light and through the fence someone else had once bent. She didn't steal food. She didn't take clothes. She only took the name she had given herself, Ava, and the memory of the children still locked behind numbered doors growing up without being seen. Marjorie Blake was the kind of woman who made donors feel like saints and children feel like shadows. With her silver-streaked hair perfectly styled into a soft bob, and her trademark pearl necklace gleaming under the studio lights, she appeared regularly on local television, always smiling as she spoke about the mission of the House of Grace, to provide shelter, dignity, and opportunity to children society had forgotten. Her voice, warm and practiced, could convince almost anyone that her life's work was saintly. The mayor praised her. Church groups sent donations in her name. Celebrities from Lexington occasionally filmed PSAs with her, unaware that the children behind her were told to smile or skip their next meal. Inside the gates of House of Grace, however, the warmth disappeared. Marjorie Blake ran the facility like a private fiefdom, coldly efficient, obsessively clean, and stripped of anything resembling a childhood. She believed discipline built character, and that too much affection led to entitlement. Children were numbers, not names. Infractions were met with silence, then isolation. If a child wet the bed, they were made to wash the sheets by hand before breakfast. If they cried, they were told tears were manipulations. And if they disobeyed more than once, their privileges, like book socks or time outside, were revoked. Marjorie kept a list of infractions on a clipboard. She never set down initials scrawled in red ink next to minor offenses that in her mind spelled moral decline. She never shouted. She didn't have to. Her silence was sharper than any slap, her smile colder than frost. Ava had seen her walk into the girls' dormitory, heels clicking against the linoleum, and without raising her voice ordered number 6 to shave her head as punishment for hiding a photograph. No one protested, not even the staff. Especially not the staff. Most were underpaid and under threat. Marjorie reminded them often that the world outside doesn't care about these children. We are their only chance, and they'd better learn to be grateful. At fundraisers, she showed carefully staged pictures, children painting, reading, gardening. What donors didn't know was that those activities were rewards for silence, not rights. Cameras were only allowed on campus when the hallways had been scrubbed spotless and the children had been prepped like actors. Ava once heard her say to a board member, "These kids have nothing. They need rules, not love." That phrase stuck with Ava like a stone in her throat. Even now, whenever she saw a pearl necklace on a passing woman, something inside her froze. Because Marjorie Blake wasn't just the head of a foster facility. She was the architect of Ava's silence, the reason she had run, and the force that still haunted her footsteps with every meal she dared to take. Ava kept it folded in the smallest pocket of her coat, the fabric worn thin and frayed at the edges from years of rubbing her fingers across its surface. It was a square of soft silk no larger than a handkerchief, faded blue with a delicate white border that had once been embroidered in careful practice stitches. In the center, almost invisible now except in certain light, was the letter A. That single initial stitched in soft rose-pink thread was the only clue to a past she had never been told, the only possession she had carried when she was first dropped off at the gates of House of Grace as a toddler. No one ever explained where she had come from. No one ever said her name. But she had clung to that letter like it was the last whisper of someone who once loved her enough to sew her name into something meant to be held close. In a place where children were labeled and numbers replaced names, the silk square was her rebellion, her memory, her secret. She never showed it to anyone, not even the kind night staffer who once snuck her an extra blanket during a storm. Ava only took it out when the other girls were asleep, when the cold pressed too deep into her bones, when she needed to feel that she had once been wanted. She would hold it beneath her nose and inhale as if the scent of someone familiar, mother-aunt stranger, might still be trapped in the fibers. On the worst nights when Marjorie Blake made a child scrub the floor with a toothbrush or denied dinner for something as small as laughter, Ava would press the cloth to her chest and whisper the name she had given herself, Ava. She didn't know if it was the name someone had once said aloud to her, or something the silk had whispered into her dreams, but it felt right. It felt like hers. She'd once tried to ask a staff member where the cloth came from, but the woman had shaken her head and said it was probably just something the intake staff forgot to throw out. That answer made Ava even more determined to keep it hidden. Years later, when she ran from the facility with only a coat and a pair of shoes, 2 sizes too big, the silk had come with her. It had been inside the coat pocket the night she wandered into the diner. It had been there when she found the baby in the woods. And now, each time her hand brushed against the fabric, it reminded her of something no punishment, no silence, no forgotten number could erase. That somewhere once someone had made something just for her and stitched the first letter of a name they thought she would never lose. Ava sat in the corner of the hospital room, arms wrapped tightly around her knees, her eyes never leaving the man who had brought her here, Daniel Whitmore. He had saved the baby, she couldn't deny that. He had carried them both through the dark, like they mattered, like he saw them. But that didn't mean she trusted him. She didn't trust anyone. Not after the years spent in the shadows of House of Grace, where smiles hid punishments and promises were tools for control. Not after being ignored, numbered, forgotten. Daniel's voice was too calm, his eyes too soft, his offers too generous. People who gave you warm food and soft blankets always expected something in return. They might wait a day or a week, but the price always came, maybe in silence, maybe in shame, maybe in the kind of look that made your skin crawl. So when Daniel asked her questions, "Are you okay? Do you have family? Can I call someone?" she said nothing. Silence was safer. Her mind fought with itself every time he spoke. A part of her, small and half-buried, wanted to believe him, wanted to think maybe he was different. But that part had been wrong before, and wrongness had consequences. She'd learned that when she once trusted a woman named Carla, who said she'd help sneak Ava a book to read only for Ava to be locked in the dark room for 3 days when the book turned out to be contraband. She'd learned it again when a social worker said she'd find Ava a real home only to vanish after one meeting and never return. Daniel was no different. He dressed in expensive coats and had the kind of clean shoes no one wore unless they came from places that didn't smell like bleach and sadness. Men like him didn't save girls like her. And even if he meant well now, even if his eyes looked honest, Ava knew honesty didn't last when the truth got inconvenient. So she kept her distance. She refused the food he brought. She flinched when he tried to hand her a blanket. She wouldn't sleep when he was in the room, even though her eyelids burned from exhaustion. Because the moment you let your guard down, they changed. They always changed. And no matter how many times he smiled or said, "You're safe now," Ava's gut screamed otherwise. Safety wasn't something she believed in. Safety was an illusion people like Daniel could afford to believe. For a girl like her, safety was a lie she couldn't afford to need. So she sat still and silent, watching his every move, waiting for the mask to drop, because it always did. At first, Daniel Whitmore intended to do what any rational man in his position would have done: call social services, hand the girl over, and continue driving. He had meetings lined up in Louisville, a board vote in Nashville, and a contract pending with investors overseas. The last thing he needed was the emotional weight of a child, especially one who stared at him with the kind of eyes that made breathing just a little harder. But as he stood outside the hospital room watching through the small rectangular window, something began to shift inside him, subtle at first, almost imperceptible but undeniable. It was the way she sat silent with drawn knees to chest arms, locked tight around herself like a fortress built from years of betrayal. It was the way her fingers gripped the fabric of her shirt, twitching slightly as if fighting off panic without letting it show. And more than anything, it was the way she never blinked when she looked at him. That gaze tore through his intentions like paper. For a brief moment, a memory struck him with the force of a crashing tide. His daughter Emily, only 7 when she died, sitting by the window during her last winter, bundled in a pale blue sweater, eyes too wise for her age, watching snow fall like it meant something. Ava's eyes were Emily's. Not exactly, not in color or shape, but in depth, in the haunted stillness of a child who had seen more than she should. That memory broke something open in him that he had locked away years ago beneath success acquisitions and the illusion of moving on. He told himself he'd made peace with Emily's death, but the truth was he'd only buried it in silence and busyness. And now, this child, this girl with no name beyond a whispered Ava, was prying it loose. So he hesitated, just for a moment. But that moment changed everything. When the nurse returned with a clipboard asking if he'd contacted child services, he said not yet. When the hospital coordinator offered to connect him to the nearest shelter, he nodded politely, but didn't move. And when Ava looked at him again, not with trust, but with the cold calculation of someone who expected him to vanish, he stayed. Something in him whispered that maybe she wasn't the one who needed saving. Maybe he was. He didn't know what he was doing. He wasn't fit to care for a traumatized child. But something deeper than logic, something shaped like grief and love, and the unbearable echo of a lost child kept him from walking away. He wasn't ready to call it fate, but he couldn't deny it felt like a second chance, and for the first time in years, Daniel Whitmore wasn't sure he could afford to ignore it. Daniel sat in the waiting room of the small-town hospital, the sterile smell of antiseptic clinging to his clothes, the low murmur of nurses behind the desk echoing in his ears like a metronome of indecision. In his hand he held the card of the state child welfare agent, standard protocol, perfectly logical, completely detached. He'd made a call already, left a message, said there was a child found in the cold, possibly homeless, no known guardian, no paperwork, no history. He had done what was expected. He had done the right thing, or so he told himself. But every time he tried to stand and leave, his legs felt heavier, as if some invisible chain tied him to that seat. Through the window of the pediatric room, he could still see Ava wrapped in a hospital blanket 2 sizes too big, sitting quietly with her back against the wall, refusing food, refusing words, refusing comfort. Her silence wasn't born from shyness, it was armor, and Daniel recognized it because he had worn the same kind for years after Emily died. He had thought the pain of losing his daughter had calcified, that grief had become manageable through routine and silence. But something about this girl was cracking it open again. He hadn't asked for this. He didn't come here seeking redemption. He didn't want to feel. Yet there it was, that ache in his chest, growing stronger with every glance at her. The social worker would arrive soon. The system would take over. That was the path. Clean, efficient, correct. But there was another voice inside him, quieter, but persistent, whispering that maybe the system had failed this girl already, that maybe fate had placed her in his path for a reason. It wasn't rational. He wasn't her family. He wasn't trained to help a child with this kind of trauma. He was a businessman, not a savior. And yet what kind of man could look into those eyes and walk away? Was the law more important than the moment? Was doing things by the book more noble than staying out of love? Could there be something more righteous in listening to the tremor in his heart than following policy to the letter? Daniel had built a life on decisions backed by contracts and guarantees. But this wasn't business. This was human. This was moral. This was a test not of legality, but of conscience. The clock on the wall ticked louder, mocking him with its certainty. And in that liminal space between duty and compassion, between protocol and presence, Daniel understood something deeply unsettling. The right thing wasn't always the legal thing, and the legal thing wasn't always right. He stood, tore the card in half, and walked toward her room, not with answers, but with the courage to stay. They left the hospital just after sunrise, the sky a dull canvas of gray, the early light barely filtering through the thick winter clouds. Daniel didn't say much during the drive, nor did Ava, who sat curled in the passenger seat with her knees drawn up to her chest, eyes scanning the world outside with a vigilance far beyond her years. She still hadn't spoken a word since the night he found her, but Daniel didn't push. He understood silence now in a way he never had before, not as absence but as defense, as armor forged in places too dark for most to imagine. He drove past the highway turnoff and into the center of town, pulling into a small shoe store that had just opened its doors. Ava didn't move at first, unsure if this was a stop or a goodbye. Daniel gently opened her door and offered a hand. She stared at it for a long moment before slowly stepping out barefoot on the cold asphalt, the hospital's temporary socks already torn. Inside the store, he watched her from a distance as she stood frozen among the shelves. It was clear no one had taken her to a place like this before. Her fingers grazed the shoes cautiously, as if afraid to want anything, let alone something new. Daniel knelt beside her eventually and held up a small pair of navy sneakers lined with fleece. "What about these?" he asked softly. Ava didn't answer, but her eyes lingered on the shoes. He paid for them, quickly asked the clerk to cut the tags, and knelt again to help her put them on. Her feet were cold, small, and trembling slightly. When the shoes were on, Daniel smiled gently and said, "Better still no words, just silence." But then as they walked out of the store and approached the truck, he tried again. "Do you have a name?" he asked quietly, not as a demand, but as a hope. Ava's steps slowed. She looked down at her feet, then at the ground, then back at Daniel, but said nothing. Instead, she reached into the deep pocket of her coat and pulled out a small, worn piece of fabric. It was a pale blue silk handkerchief, the edges frayed from time and use, and embroidered in the corner was a single letter A. She held it close, clutching it to her chest, her fingers wrapped tight as if the fabric might vanish if she loosened her grip. Daniel didn't speak again. He didn't need to. In that moment, the gesture said more than any name could. She might not have had the words yet, might not have trusted him with her voice, but she had given him something even more sacred, a glimpse into her past, a fragment of identity, a tiny, silent cry for recognition. And for Daniel, that was enough. He didn't need to know the whole story, not yet. He just needed to stay. The cabin was quiet, lit only by the soft amber glow of the fireplace crackling gently in the corner. Outside, the wind howled against the windows, carrying with it the sharp sting of early winter. Inside, Daniel sat on the worn sofa, a mug of untouched tea growing cold in his hands, his gaze drifting toward the girl wrapped in a thick blanket on the other end. Ava hadn't moved in nearly an hour, just sat there, knees to chest eyes, fixed on the flames as if they might whisper something she needed to hear. He didn't speak. He'd learned quickly that silence was a kind of respect with her, a way of saying, "I'm here if you need me, but I won't force you." And yet he couldn't stop the quiet ache in his chest, the desire to reach her, to know her even just a little. A storm had started outside. The snow tapped lightly at the window panes, and the wind groaned like a wounded animal. But the cabin felt insulated from it all, held in a stillness that was almost sacred. Daniel shifted slightly, not wanting to startle her, and leaned forward, setting the mug down on the table. "You don't have to tell me anything," he said softly, not expecting an answer, just letting the words hang there like a promise. "But if you ever feel ready, I'd like to know your name." There was a long pause. So long he thought maybe she hadn't heard, or maybe she had but chosen as always to stay silent. But then he heard it, a sound so faint it might have been imagined, a breath barely louder than the fire itself. His head turned sharply, eyes narrowing in disbelief. The girl hadn't moved, but her lips had parted, her voice trembling with effort. "Ava." The word came out like a secret she'd held for too long, wrapped in dust and fear and silence. It was the smallest whisper, but to Daniel it struck louder than any thunder. His chest tightened. She didn't look at him when she said it, didn't offer it like a gift or an invitation. She said it like someone testing the sound of their own truth for the first time in years, as if unsure it still belonged to her. Ava, not a number, not a case file, not a shadow, a name. Her name. He didn't smile right away, didn't speak. Instead, he just nodded, the corners of his eyes stinging unexpectedly. "Ava," he repeated gently, as if saying it out loud might make it real, might make her feel real. And in that moment, something shifted. Not the room, not the fire, not even the snow outside, but something deeper, something between them, a thread of trust, fragile but present, pulled taut by the power of a single word. Her name, Ava. It began with a restlessness Daniel couldn't shake, a gnawing unease that clung to him every time Ava flinched at a door creaking open or instinctively backed away from any sudden movement. There was something in her silence, something buried so deep it refused to be spoken, but its weight filled every room they were in. Daniel had spent years trusting systems, believing in protocols and procedures, in background checks and government agencies, but this time he trusted his gut more. And his gut told him something was very, very wrong. So he made a call, not to the state, not to child services, but to Marcus Ellis, a private investigator he'd worked with once during a business dispute that had unraveled a web of corruption inside one of his own companies. Marcus didn't ask many questions, just agreed to look into a place called House of Grace. Daniel handed him the name with little more than a location and a warning, be discreet. Days passed, then a week. When Marcus finally called back, his voice was different, lower, heavier. "You're not going to like this," he said. What followed wasn't a simple report, but a storm. Marcus had found documents, scans of falsified adoption records, financial transfers to offshore accounts, and internal emails hinting at a dark trade masquerading as salvation. The House of Grace, founded under the guise of faith and charity, was a pipeline. Children were taken in stripped of their identities, renamed and rebranded as blank slates just like Ava had been. Some were moved through a series of temporary homes, never staying long enough to form bonds. Others were adopted out of the country entirely to families with large donations and even larger silences. The records were sanitized. The children's pasts erased their real names, lost under layers of forged paperwork and doctored files. And then there were the interviews former employees tracked down by Marcus, most too afraid to speak, but a few willing to whisper what they'd seen: children punished for speaking, confined to rooms for days, forced to memorize new names and forget old ones. They called it discipline. They called it order. But it was abuse, systemic, sanctioned, and deeply hidden. Daniel sat alone in his study that night, a man once trained to weigh risks and measure cost, now confronting a horror no spreadsheet could explain. He looked at the files Marcus had sent Ava's number among them, scribbled on a daily behavior log like an inmate's record. Child 4, silent today. Refused lunch. Assigned prayer confinement. He closed the laptop slowly, his hands shaking with fury. The House of Grace wasn't a shelter. It was a machine, one built to erase, to sell, to disappear children like Ava into quiet, untraceable suffering. And for the first time since taking her in, Daniel knew that keeping her safe wasn't enough. He had to burn the whole damn place down. Daniel had anticipated resistance, but nothing could have prepared him for the sheer force of institutional inertia that met his accusations. When he brought the evidence to the local child welfare office, files, testimony, financial records, he expected urgency, maybe even outrage. Instead, he received skepticism disguised as procedure. The woman behind the desk, her badge reading J. Carter Sr., case officer, gave him a practiced smile, the kind that didn't reach her eyes. "We appreciate your concern, Mr. Whitmore," she said in a clipped tone, "but these kinds of matters must be investigated thoroughly. It's important we don't jump to conclusions based on emotion." Emotion. As if what he'd uncovered, dozens of redacted files, missing children, and psychologically scarred survivors, was a feeling, not a fact. As if Ava's entire identity being wiped clean and replaced with a number was just a misunderstanding. Within 48 hours, Marjorie Blake had mobilized. The same woman who ruled over the House of Grace like a benevolent empress on paper now appeared on every local news channel in a perfectly tailored navy suit, seated beside smiling children, too young or too scared to contradict her narrative. "It saddens me," she told the press, her tone heavy with performative sincerity, "that a man of Mr. Whitmore's stature would exploit vulnerable children to craft a redemption arc for himself. We do not traffic in fame at the House of Grace. We traffic in hope." The word choice was deliberate and deadly. Almost overnight, Daniel found himself the target of a coordinated smear campaign. Anonymous articles popped up online questioning his motivations. A viral blog post accused him of trying to erase Ava's real placement history in order to adopt her unlawfully. Social media turned savage, dividing public opinion between those who saw him as a protector and those who swallowed Marjorie's narrative whole, that he was a wealthy man trying to use an orphan as a personal rebranding tool. Even former business rivals chimed in, not out of conviction, but opportunism. One headline read, "From tech mogul to savior Daniel Whitmore, accused of manipulating foster system for personal gain." Meanwhile, House of Grace locked down. When Marcus attempted a second visit under a false name, he was turned away at the gate by armed security and a warning letter from their legal team. Staff refused to speak. Records that were once available vanished overnight. The machine was protecting itself, and it was powerful. But the worst blow came when Ava was called in for a surprise wellness check by two social workers who arrived unannounced. Daniel watched as she froze at the sight of their uniforms, shrinking behind the couch, eyes wide, with a fear so raw it made his stomach turn. That was the moment he knew this wasn't just a legal fight. It was a war for narrative, and in wars like this, truth was only as strong as the one willing to scream it louder than the lie. The courtroom was silent, the kind of silence that felt like it could break under the weight of a single breath. Ava sat in the corner, barely noticeable in her oversized hoodie, her small hands clasped tightly together on her lap. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. Her very presence, fragile but defiant, was a statement louder than any words. Daniel sat at the front, eyes forward, his jaw locked tight, as the judge, a seasoned woman with silver streaks in her hair and eyes sharp from decades of reading liars, scanned the documents before her. The opposing counsel had already painted him as a billionaire playing savior, accusing him of orchestrating a media spectacle for personal gain. This is not a rescue mission, they insisted. This is a PR campaign. But then Daniel stood, calmly, purposefully. He didn't look at the cameras or the reporters or the skeptical glances from the jury box. He looked at the judge. "Your Honor," he said, "I'd like to submit a video exhibit into evidence." There was a low murmur as the bailiff handed over the flash drive. The screen flickered to life. A grainy image appeared, a middle-aged woman, worn and weary, seated at a kitchen table, wringing her hands. The timestamp was recent. "My name is Sarah Jenkins," she said in the recording. "I worked at House of Grace for 7 years. I can't live with it anymore. We weren't allowed to call them by name. Just numbers. We were told that names made them harder to move. Too much attachment," Marjorie would say. She said if the kids started feeling like people, it'd complicate the paperwork. Her voice cracked. "I saw things. Kids punished for crying. Locked in rooms for asking questions. And when someone tried to run, they'd erase their records and say the child was never assigned. They said we were saving them, but we were breaking them." The video ended. No one spoke. Even the opposing counsel looked shaken. Daniel turned slowly toward Ava. She met his gaze just for a moment. A flicker of something passed between them, trust maybe, or the beginnings of it. The judge cleared her throat, voice low. "Mr. Whitmore, where did you obtain this testimony?" "She came to us," Daniel replied. "Out of guilt. Out of courage. Because she saw Ava on the news and couldn't stay silent any longer." The judge nodded slowly, then looked at Ava. "Miss, would you like to speak?" Ava's eyes widened. She opened her mouth but then closed it again, shaking her head. But her silence didn't feel like weakness. It felt like resistance. Like dignity. Daniel stepped back, not pressing her, letting the moment hold. And in that courtroom, surrounded by law and lies and the echoes of broken systems, it became clear the truth didn't need volume. It just needed to survive. The room held its breath as the judge looked once more toward Ava, her gavel resting motionless beside her hand, waiting. The murmurs from the courtroom had faded after Daniel's last statement and the video confession, but now it was as if time had slowed to a whisper, every eye fixed on the little girl who had spent most of the hearing shrinking behind layers of silence. Ava sat motionless for a moment, hands clenched tightly in her lap, the sleeves of her faded hoodie swallowing her wrists. Then slowly, almost too slowly, she stood. The bailiff instinctively stepped forward, unsure if she was supposed to intervene, but the judge raised a hand. "Let her," she said softly. Ava walked forward, small steps on the polished wood floor echoing louder than any declaration. She reached the microphone set just below the bench, standing on tiptoe to reach it. Her lips trembled at first the way they used to when she tried to mouth words and nothing came out. But something was different now. Her eyes scanned the room, briefly landing on Daniel, who didn't move, didn't mouth encouragement. Just met her gaze with a kind of steady stillness that told her he was there no matter what happened. Then she turned back to the microphone. Her voice came out small at first, hesitant like a thread being pulled from the shadows. "My name is Ava." There was a pause. No one breathed, and then she continued, firmer this time, the syllables tightening into steel. "And I don't want to go back there." The silence that followed was not empty. It was filled with something sacred, like the sound of chains breaking. The judge's eyes flicked toward the court reporter to ensure the statement was recorded, but her attention quickly returned to Ava. "Do you understand what you're saying, sweetheart?" Ava nodded. "Yes, ma'am. I remember how it smells. The floors were always cold. They called me number 4. I don't want to be a number. I want to be Ava." There was no dramatic music, no crescendo. Just a courtroom stunned into reverence by the courage of a girl who had every reason to remain silent and chose instead to speak. The opposing attorney shifted uncomfortably in their seat, flipping through documents that now seemed irrelevant. Marjorie Blake, seated near the back in a powder blue blazer, went pale, her carefully cultivated composure starting to crack. Her lips twitched, but she said nothing. The judge leaned forward, voice gentle. "And who do you feel safe with, Ava?" Ava turned, her chin lifting slightly, and pointed without hesitation. "Him," she said, voice clear. "Daniel Whitmore." That was the moment. Everything shifted. Not because of money or evidence or legal maneuvering, but because a child finally said her name out loud and refused to be erased again. The ruling came down with a formality that echoed louder than any gavel strike, though the judge's voice was calm, almost gentle, as she said the words that would shift Ava's world forever. In light of the child's testimony and the supporting evidence, the court grants Mr. Daniel Whitmore temporary guardianship of Ava pending further review. No applause followed, no dramatics unfolded, just a silence that buzzed with something like hope. Daniel exhaled his shoulders, finally releasing the tension he'd carried since the day he pulled over on that rain-soaked road. Ava sat beside him, her hand gripping the frayed edge of her sleeve, eyes wide, not with fear this time, but something closer to wonder. The moment they left the courthouse, the world outside didn't look different. Same gray clouds, same cold sidewalks, but everything had changed. Ava didn't speak much during the car ride home, and Daniel didn't press her. He simply glanced at her now and then through the mirror, watching her fingers trace the outline of the court-issued envelope that held her new school placement and temporary ID, an ID that had her full name on it for the first time in her life. That night, Daniel walked her through the house quietly. No grand gestures, no fanfare. Just gentle guidance. "This one's yours," he said, stopping in front of a door painted a soft sage green. Ava stepped inside. A real bed stood in the corner. Not a cot, not a mat, but a bed with a warm quilt folded neatly at the foot. A desk with colored pencils waited by the window. On the door, carved in clean block letters, was a wooden plaque, AVA. She froze, staring at it as if she didn't trust her eyes. Slowly, she reached out, fingers grazing the surface like it might disappear. "It's yours," Daniel said again, softer this time. "And it's not going anywhere." She nodded, swallowing hard. Later that week, Ava walked into a classroom for the first time as someone with a name. The teacher greeted her with a warm smile and pointed to a desk with a little card that read, "Ava Whitmore." She hesitated only a second before sitting down. For the first time, no one called her a number. For the first time, she had a toothbrush that was only hers, a closet with hangers waiting for clothes, a nightlight that stayed on until she fell asleep. For the first time, when she woke up in the morning, someone said, "Good morning, Ava." And she believed they meant it. In a world that had once called her invisible, she had become seen not through spectacle, but through the quiet revolution of a door, with her name on it, a bowl of cereal waiting in the kitchen, and a man who had every reason to walk away, but chose instead to stay. It happened on a quiet afternoon, the kind of day when nothing seems remarkable on the surface, but everything shifts beneath it. The sky outside was pale and still, soft light drifting through the windows of the kitchen where Ava sat at the table, colored pencils scattered around her like fallen leaves. Daniel stood at the counter stirring soup, not speaking, simply content in the silence they now shared with ease. In the beginning, her silences had been thick with fear, stitched shut by years of not being heard. But now her silences were different, softer chosen. She hummed to herself as she drew tongue slightly poking out in concentration, her small fingers working with gentle determination. Daniel glanced over from time to time, watching the way her brow furrowed and softened, wondering what world she was creating on that page. When she finally looked up, her eyes met his with a lightness he hadn't seen before. "Bah, Daniel," she said quietly, her voice unforced simple, like she had always called him that, and just forgot for a while. The word struck him in the chest, not with pain, but with a kind of quiet joy so deep it felt like something he had lost long ago was being returned without ceremony. He turned from the stove, slowly wiping his hands on a dish towel as she stood up and walked toward him, the drawing held gently in her hands. "This is for you," she said, holding it out like a gift wrapped in trust. He took it carefully. The paper was warm from her touch. It showed two figures standing side by side in a field of green, a house in the background with smoke curling from the chimney, and above them a blue sky with a single sun that smiled down, not in cartoonish exaggeration, but with the quiet serenity only a child can draw. The two figures were unmistakable, one tall, with silver hair and kind eyes, the other small with a bright yellow dress and a hand that reached up toward his. Between them was a heart. Below it, written in wobbly letters, were the words, "My family." Daniel didn't speak at first. His throat tightened and he had to look away for a second before meeting her eyes again. "Thank you, Ava," he said, his voice a little hoarse. "I'll keep it forever." She smiled shy but steady, then turned back to the table to begin a new drawing. Daniel pinned the picture to the fridge right in the center, where nothing else could distract from it. That night, after she had fallen asleep, he stood in the hallway for a long while watching the gentle rise and fall of her chest, knowing that no court order or official paper could ever match the quiet finality of being drawn into a child's idea of home. On a quiet Sunday morning, Daniel stood in the center of the living room, sunlight spilling through the windows and landing on the wooden floors like soft golden waves. In his hands, he held a simple wooden frame, one that he had emptied out days ago, but hadn't known how to fill until now. He moved with quiet purpose, eyes focused, heart steady, as he opened the back of the frame and carefully placed inside a folded piece of silk, Ava's scarf, the one with the stitched letter A. It was no longer pristine. The edges were frayed and the fabric bore the faintest marks of years spent hidden in the shadows of institutions and silence. But to Daniel it was more precious than any photograph, more telling than any document. It was the only thing Ava had brought with her from that other life, the one she rarely spoke of, the one that lived behind her cautious eyes and guarded smiles. She had clutched it like a lifeline when she first arrived, had slept with it tucked beneath her pillow, and once, when she thought no one was looking, she had pressed it to her cheek with such tenderness that it had brought tears to Daniel's eyes. Now it would live where it belonged. Not in a drawer, not in a box, but on the wall, in plain sight, part of the home they were building together. Above the scarf, he placed a photograph he had taken just a few days prior, Ava sitting on the porch barefoot, and beaming, her hair tangled by the wind, her hand raised mid-wave as if to say, "I'm here. I made it." Around the scarf and photo, he arranged smaller images, snapshots of afternoons spent at the park, messy breakfasts, watercolor paintings taped to the fridge, and a picture of the two of them taken by a stranger at the market. In every photo, Ava was smiling. Not the guarded smile of a child used to hiding, but the open, unburdened smile of someone who had begun to believe in safety. When he stepped back to look at the frame, he didn't just see images in silk. He saw the journey, hers and his. He saw the moment he almost drove away, but didn't, the night she whispered her name, the first time she called him back Daniel, and the invisible threads of trust that had slowly stitched them into something real. Hanging the frame in the center of the living room, just above the fireplace, Daniel felt a quiet sense of finality. Not the end of a story, but the solid beginning of something unbreakable. When Ava walked in later and saw it, she paused. Her eyes widened for just a moment, and then she walked over, reached up and touched the silk through the glass. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. He watched her. And in that silence he understood the scarf was no longer just a memory of where she came from. It was now a symbol of where she had landed, of who she had become, and of the family that had found each other in the most unexpected way. Not everyone is born with a name. Some come into the world already forgotten, labeled by numbers, shuffled through systems that strip identity down to paperwork and protocol. Ava had once been one of them, a child without a name, without a history, without anyone who stayed. But names are more than syllables. They are declarations of presence, anchors in the storm. And being called by your name, truly called, is a quiet kind of salvation. Ava didn't whisper her name out of pride that day. It was a reclamation, a gentle insistence that she existed, that she mattered, that someone had finally stayed long enough to listen. Daniel, a man who had nearly driven away, ended up staying because something deeper than obligation rooted him there, love without condition, presence without reward. And in that staying, Ava bloomed. The girl once known only as Number 4 became Ava, the girl who draws, who laughs, who looks out windows and imagines futures. This was never just a story about rescue. It was about recognition, about the truth that every human being, no matter how forgotten or small, deserves to be seen, named, and loved. Because in the end, a name is not a luxury. It is a promise that someone will stay, that someone will call you not as a case file or statistic, but as a person worth remembering, worth everything. Daniel stood in the center of the old red brick building he had quietly purchased on the outskirts of Maple Hollow, the same town where it had all begun, where a freezing rain and a silent child had changed everything. The renovation had taken months, but now it was ready walls freshly painted in warm earth tones, soft lights glowing from the windows in rooms filled with beds that had names already etched above them. No numbers, no files, just names, real names. He called it Ava House. Not a shelter, not an institution, but a home, a permanent one. A place where children who had once been lost in the system could find more than just a roof over their heads. Here, they would have teachers who remembered birthdays, counselors who sat on floors to listen, and a library where every child's name was printed on the first page of a book they got to write themselves. At Ava House, there were no locked doors, no blank stares, no echoing silence. Only names being called at breakfast, laughter during art sessions, and the quiet comfort of being known. Daniel made sure of it. Every child was greeted by name, every photo on the wall had a story, and every story started not with trauma, but with truth. Ava, now always beside him, helped paint the front gate in sky blue. And on the brass plate above the door it read, Ava House, where every child is seen. Ava stood at the entrance of the playroom watching as the first group of children arrived at Ava House, some clutching small plastic bags, others with nothing at all but the clothes on their backs and the guarded silence in their eyes, the same silence she once carried like armor. But now she was different, not because her past had disappeared, but because she had found a name and someone who stayed. So when a little girl with tangled braids and wide, frightened eyes sat curled in the corner, Ava didn't hesitate. She knelt down slowly, offering a soft hairbrush, then gently began untangling the knots with small, patient strokes. "Your name?" she asked softly. The girl hesitated. "I don't know." Ava smiled and whispered, "Then you get to choose. But whatever you choose, we'll say it every day." One by one, Ava moved from child to child, brushing out knots, offering crayons and soft words, calling each by name as they whispered them, real or newly chosen, into her ear like a secret. "That's Joseph," she told the volunteers later. "He likes yellow. That's Mia. She hums when she draws." She wasn't staff or social worker. She was something else entirely, living proof that healing was possible, that names mattered, and that sometimes the smallest hands could do the gentlest work of making others feel seen. In the end, Ava's story is not just a tale about a lost girl and a grieving man. It's a reminder of something much larger, that names carry meaning, presence, carries power, and every child, no matter how broken or forgotten, deserves to be seen, remembered, and called by the name they choose. In our fast-paced world, it's easy to overlook the quiet ones, the small voices, the children who slip through the cracks of systems that were meant to protect them. But sometimes all it takes is one person who decides to stay. One person to ask, "What's your name?" and mean it. One person to say, "I see you." If we each took a moment to look up from our lives and truly see someone at school, in our communities, even on the street, we could begin to heal wounds we don't even know exist. You don't have to build a shelter to make a difference. You don't have to be rich or powerful. Sometimes the most powerful act of love is consistency, showing up again and again and saying, "I won't leave." Ava's journey teaches us that no one is invisible forever, that healing doesn't come from grand gestures, but from quiet ones repeated over time. So here's a question for you. Who in your life needs to be called by name? Who's waiting to be seen? Not for who they were, but for who they might become, if someone just stayed. If this story touched your heart, let us know in the comments. What part moved you most? Don't forget to save this video, share it with someone who needs hope, and subscribe for more powerful stories that remind us everyone deserves to be seen.